Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer. And this video is going to look at some questions that I have been receiving around the relationship between two buyer brokers when one single buyer has signed a buyer brokerage services agreement with two different brokers. And the scenario is coming up in a variety of different ways. It could be that buyer has signed a buyer brokerage services agreement with a broker, and then they either don't realize what they've done or they are deceptive with the second broker. They don't tell the second broker about the first buyer broker. Certainly that happens. Another scenario that I'm seeing come up from time to time, I've gotten several questions along this fact pattern, is a scenario where buyer fully intends to work with a certain broker. Maybe they've been lifelong friends, maybe they've already formed a professional relationship, but buyer hasn't yet signed the buyer brokerage services agreement. But buyer finds themselves at an open house or at a new home construction site or somewhere. And in order to view a property, they are asked first to sign a buyer brokerage services agreement, not fully understanding what they signed. They signed the buyer brokerage services agreement. And again, every fact pattern has its own scenario. The first buyer broker who signs that buyer brokerage services agreement, it might be a long agreement, it might be a large geographical area, but for whatever reason, buyer is now in a buyer brokerage services agreement that they regret. And they want to be in a buyer brokerage services agreement with another agent. At this point, there's any variety of ways that this fact pattern can develop. Buyer should go to the first buyer broker and ask, is there something that I can do to terminate the buyer brokerage services agreement, to amend it, to whatever? That's an issue for buyer and the first buyer broker. And that's not what I want to focus on in this video. Because where I'm hearing this scenario is the two buyer brokers have been able to work out a working relationship with each other. They agree that buyer broker number two will pay a referral fee to buyer broker number one, or whatever. Whatever the relationship is, whatever their solution is, it doesn't matter for the purposes of this video. For the purposes of this video, I want you to assume that the relationship between buyer and buyer broker number one gets resolved somehow. And now buyer broker number two is asking this question. What now? What now for me? My buyer now wants to enter a buyer brokerage services agreement with me. Here's one of the questions I've gotten. Can I negotiate different terms than what the buyer had already agreed with that first broker? Because the buyer had agreed to pay buyer broker number one 5 apples. I'm only going to charge the buyer 4 apples. Can I change the terms of the buyer brokerage services agreement? Absolutely. That buyer brokerage services agreement between buyer and buyer broker number one is a contract between them. It has nothing to do with the terms of contract that you might enter with that same buyer. Two totally separate contracts. There's no connection whatsoever between these two contracts. You can have whatever term of contract in the second contract that makes sense to you. Another question that I've received along these same lines is this. When my buyer signs a new contract with me, does that then cancel out that first agreement? So let's say the buyer and the buyer broker number one, have figured out whatever they're going to do. Does the buyers entering into a contract with me automatically cancel out that first buyer brokerage services agreement? No, that's a standalone contract. Buyer is going to have to terminate that agreement with the first broker, or buyer is going to be subject to the terms of that agreement with the first broker. Those two fact patterns describe a scenario where buyer and buyer broker number one have been able to figure out their relationship. And buyer broker number two is working with buyer now in coordination with the resolution from buyer broker number one. What about a fact pattern where buyer did not disclose that there was a buyer broker number one and simply signed a contract with buyer broker number two? And now buyer and buyer broker number two are at the closing table, and up comes buyer broker number one asserting a claim to compensation. And the question that I've received repeatedly is, what obligation do I, as the buyer broker number 2, owe to buyer broker number 1? And again, we've run the spectrum of answers to this question. Some buyer broker number 2 have taken the position that they are not entitled to compensation because buyer broker number 1 usurps their right to a compensation, and they simply give their compensation to buyer broker number 1. Other buyer brokers have reached some agreement to share compensation with buyer broker number 1. And then other buyer brokers have taken what is actually the contractually accurate position, which is to say, buyer broker number 1, I as buyer broker number 2 owe you nothing. If you have a claim, buyer broker number 1, it's against buyer. It's not against me. Now, maybe buyer broker number 2, those buyer broker number 2s out there who have reached some accommodation with buyer broker number 1, it has been in an effort to alleviate an obligation for buyer so that buyer no longer has to deal with this issue after closing. Because otherwise, buyer broker number 1 has a claim against buyer after closing based on the terms of the contract. Good claim, bad claim, it's going to depend upon the actual fact pattern. But as a matter of contract, buyer broker number 2, I want you to know you do not owe, as a matter of contract, anything to buyer broker number 1. That is buyer's obligation to buyer broker number 1. Could there be a code of ethics issue? Potentially. I'm not addressing the code of ethics in this hotline answer. If you believe that the code of ethics required some different action by buyer broker number 2 before they entered a buyer broker agreement with buyer, if you're buyer broker number 1 in this scenario, and you believe buyer broker number 2 violated the code of ethics, you should raise that issue with your local realtor association. Again, looking at this as a matter of Washington law and contract law specifically, no claim. If you have questions on this topic or any other, please send a question to me by visiting warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.